All right, good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I am Susan Chapman, and I'm a director in the Lynchburg office. And I spend an incredible amount of time working with single audits and grants, and that's why I'm fortunate enough to talk to you this morning about this particular topic. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about moving past coronavirus relief fund and getting into our new pot of money, the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery fund, which is a bigger pot of money with a lot more going on. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box or the question box as we go. Alexa, let me know. I will ask that if you have questions about the allowability of a specific project or a specific cost, that you reach out to me directly one-on-one so we can make sure that we talk about those and get all the facts straight before we really reach any conclusions. My contact information is on this very first slide, and everyone should have gotten a copy of the slide deck. Today, we'll go over a little bit of just an overview of the CSLFRF, talk about a couple of, to me, very important differences between the two different pots of money, a few other kind of tips and hints and reminders, some single audit impacts, and then I gave you a couple of slides at the very end. They're just some good resources to go get additional information out there as you kind of work through this process and on this journey. So just what is the CSLFRF? This was one of many programs funded in March 2021 with the passage of the American Rescue Plan Act. The ARPA passed a lot of federal money. This was not the only one, and this is definitely not designed to be CRF Part 2. This program is actually designed to help the country move past the immediate urgent response mindset of CRF and focus on recovery and moving forward. They took a longer term focus with this money and expect you to take a longer term focus on what you're looking at with your project. Localities and states received the first tranche of funding in late spring 2021, and all of you should be receiving your second tranche sometime this spring. It was supposed to be at least a year between the two tranches from how the language was written in the legislation. Nearly concurrent with that first tranche of funding, Treasury released about 150-page interim final rule that guided the use of the funds. That interim document contained many questions from Treasury, and Treasury invited a lot of feedback, and they really seemed to take that feedback to heart. Treasury finally released the final rule, just leave it at that, on January 6, 2022. They seem to take this feedback, their own interpretations of the law, and provided a substantial detailed guidance on the use of these funds. This final rule is actually not effective until April 1, 2022. However, Treasury has issued guidance on its website that says you can use this guidance now and you will not face any sort of repercussions from doing so. And in that reminder, and in that document, Treasury states, as a reminder, you must start using this guidance as of April 1. Honestly, we're only a couple months away from that. If you're working on building your projects and your plans now, you really should be building them in accordance with the final rule document. There are 4 key eligible use categories for this program: public sector revenues, public health and economic response, premium pay for essential workers, and water and sewer broadband infrastructure. And we're kind of going to talk about a little bit about each of these over the next few slides. Public sector revenues, this is probably the most interesting one to a lot of people. With this funding, you are allowed to replace lost revenue. In the interim guidance, Treasury had a required calculation that you had to complete on a calendar year basis. With the final rule, you now have a couple of options. The first is you can choose to take up to $10 million of your total allotment as a stated revenue loss amount, meaning you don't have to do a calculation. Or you can still choose to do your calculation. And you may want to pursue that if you're a locality that knows you lost a lot of revenue during the course of this pandemic. There are some places that will definitely come up with more than $10 million in loss. Treasury has changed 2 key things with that calculation as well in the final rule. They increased the standard inflation rate to 5.2%. And they also allow you to complete your calculations either on the calendar year or the fiscal year. As you're doing reporting, we'll talk about reporting a little bit later, Treasury has come out and said that once you pick a fiscal year or a calendar year, you have to stick with that choice. You can pick standard option now and change your mind later, those kinds of things, but you cannot change your fiscal year or calendar year choice once you make it. Treasury has also said that, and one of the key things in doing this calculation is you must adjust your actual revenues for the effects of any tax cuts or tax increases adopted after January 6, 2022, the date the final rule was issued. That's a very key sentence there, and I wanted to point it out. The interim guidance only talked about tax cuts. It did not talk about tax increases. I think that was from a lot of feedback Treasury got. You can use revenue loss claimed funds for general government services. Treasury has defined this as any service traditionally provided by a local government with a few exceptions. We're going to discuss the exceptions and things you can't use these funds for a little bit later. And I will point out to you, for those of you that are in smaller localities that are part of this, Treasury has also said that you can claim your total allocation under revenue loss with the standard allowance up to, if your total allocation is $10 million or less. You don't get more. You can't go get $10 million if you only were awarded $5 million originally, but you can claim your entire $5 million, for example, to that standard deduction if you so choose. Polling question number 1, I'll let Alexa throw it up. Are you planning to use the standard revenue loss allocation, or you're calculating your own revenue loss amount right now? What's your current plan?
Launching the poll now.
Alexa, we got any questions in yet?
We have not had any come in yet.
All right. Figured I'd check while we had a second.
Closing the poll now.
Great.
All righty, so our winner at 49% was standard, and it was very close between I'm a super awesome auditor at 28% and calculating the loss at 23%.
Well, I'm glad our super awesome auditors are paying attention and pick the right one. I will point out in that revenue loss that you can, if you decided, hey, I'm going to do standard deduction, you start doing a calculation later and to say, no, I really want to do the calculation process, Treasury has indicated that is acceptable. You are not married to the choice between standard and the calculation. You just can't go between calendar year and fiscal year calculation. Just as a heads up for those of you who may be on the fence still. I'll switch gears. The broadest category within the 4 eligible use categories is public health and economic impact. Treasury has packed a ton of options and a ton of things into this particular category. It made it really kind of cumbersome. However, through this process, Treasury has built in an analysis that they kind of seem to expect you to take into consideration as you're determining what projects you want to do. Treasury wants you to look at the impacts of specific individuals or classes or groups of individuals or businesses and determine how they were impacted. They then expect you to provide responses to those impacts that are reasonably proportional to the impact. A good example of this would be throughout the pandemic, some businesses have obviously had a lot of struggles and have been greatly impacted, and others have flourished, depending upon what they do. So a program that gives a flat $10,000 to every business under 20 employees within your locality is probably not going to be considered a reasonably proportional response. However, a program that is designed to aid businesses that are heavily tourism focused, for example, and dealt with shutdowns and decreased traffic, would likely be acceptable because those businesses have suffered prolonged losses due to the pandemic. That's kind of what Treasury means by reasonably proportional to the impact. They want to make sure you're really benefiting those who are most impacted with your funds. Within the public health and economic impacts, there's a lot of subcategories. The very first one is support the public health response. And Treasury has, in this included COVID-19 mitigation and containment, medical expenses, behavioral health care, and preventing and responding to violence. There is a long list of possible approved options by Treasury within their guidance. A few examples of these would be things like vaccination programs, which would be very important if maybe you're in a locality the vaccination rate is lagging, testing programs, medical facilities related to COVID treatment and mitigation, ventilation system improvements, paid family and medical leave for public employees to enable compliance with COVID mitigation precautions, prevention, crisis care, inpatient, outpatient treatment, diversion programs, et cetera, to aid in treatment, harm reduction, and long-term recovery support from mental health and substance abuse issues. Treasury really seems to have picked up on a lot of the information out there that shows there was a lot of mental health fallout from this ongoing pandemic. And finally, there's also in there about behavioral health facilities and equipment, enhanced behavioral health support in schools, community violence intervention programs to help respond to increased violence. There has been increased gun violence and domestic violence, in large part probably attributed to the stressors of the pandemic. And there's a variety of ways you can respond to that is brought up within Treasury's guidance. And really, again, it's going through the analysis process and determining what is the most benefit to your locality. This funding actually allows you to do direct assistance to individuals or groups of households. And this is a fairly broad category of assistance. Again, Treasury is wanting to look at those that were impacted or what they consider to be disproportionately impacted. Impacted households are those that are lower moderate income, experiencing unemployment. Maybe these are households that have been tourism, employed families, different things along those lines where they have dealt with prolonged unemployment or they have food or housing insecurity. Households that qualify for certain federal programs are also considered impacted. As a definition, low and moderate income is defined by Treasury as being at 65% of your area's median income or 300% of the federal poverty guidelines. Disproportionately, households have a very similar description, except that they are 40% of area median income and 185% of federal poverty guidelines. Households in qualified census tracts, I did not go in and start looking to see how many qualified census tracts are within our state. There's quite a few within Virginia, Tennessee, and West Virginia. I know there's some from all three states on this webinar today. Households receiving assistance from tribal governments are considered disproportionately impacted, and households in the U.S. territory would also be considered disproportionately impacted. The level of assistance that can be provided does vary somewhat depending on whether they're impacted or disproportionately impacted. You'll notice at the bottom of my slide, there's a few that say DIH for disproportionately impacted households. Those are allowable for those households, but not for a regular impacted household. Things such as food assistance, rent and mortgage and utility assistance. Actual cash payment assistance is allowable under this program. I don't think we have that option under CRF at all. Health care insurance coverage expansion, paid sick and family leave, financial services, helping those who struggle with banking or considered what they call unbanked. They don't have a reliable bank account. They survive off of debit cards and cash or prepaid cards. Affordable housing development, permanent supportive housing, childcare, all of those things can be allowable to households depending on the situation and the circumstances involved. I lumped small businesses and nonprofits together because there's some overlap there in how they operate, very similar in terms of what they consider impacted and disproportionately impacted, and the types of assistance. But you are allowed to, again, assist small businesses and nonprofits with the pandemic, just like you are with CRF, but it's defined slightly differently. Impacted small businesses are those that had increased costs, decreased revenues and gross receipts, financial insecurity. They had shutdowns. They had similar impacts to what you see with people being unemployed. Their businesses that employed them will be considered impacted. Disproportionately impacted small businesses are very similar, except that they can be in a qualified census tract, tribal government, or a U.S. territory. A nonprofit, the definitions again are very, very similar, but it would be decreased revenues and increased demand. And you're allowed to do loans or grants. You can do technical assistance to provide help. The key here is a disproportionately impacted businesses. You can assist them with things such as a rehab of their commercial property, startup assistance, incubators, grants for expansion. If they are disproportionately affected, the assistance is bigger. With a not-for-profit, you can also include additional responses that would be reasonably proportional to addressing the disparities that led to the disproportionate impact. If you have a nonprofit who has just really stepped up and really provided a lot of assistance to people, and they are in a qualified census tract or providing assistance within tribal lands, or have really been in an area that's taken a hit, you're probably going to be able to do a little bit more for them. The guidance is not quite as specific to that, what the definition is, but there are examples in the guidance as well for those nonprofits. And then I'll kind of lump these together, not intentionally, but because they're both kind of murky. AIDS impacted industries. So we go from businesses and we go to actual impacted industries. Treasury has stated explicitly the travel, tourism, and hospitality sectors are considered impacted. So any industries within those sectors are considered impacted. Other industries may be considered impacted if they experienced 8% or more employment loss from their pre-pandemic levels, or they are experiencing comparable or worse economic impacts as the travel, tourism, and hospitality sectors. I'm not quite sure how you would define some of that. Treasury does not give a hard percentage like they did for the employment loss, but they do say you have to be able to show worse impact. The assistance here would be loans, COVID-19 mitigation, infection preventions that could allow or aid in reopening, and technical and other assistance. This last one, restore and bolster public sector capacity. Obviously, local governments didn't shut their doors during the pandemic, did not close, and had to keep providing a lot of really key and important services. However, you also dealt with losses, and you also had to look at furloughing and laying off staff, particularly in areas that could not function as normal, such as parks and rec. Within the public sector capacity, Treasury has allowed for the payment of public health, public safety, and human service staff to the extent time is spent responding to COVID-19. These are not blanket, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but you're going to have to provide proof they are working within the pandemic response. You are allowed to rehire and restore staffing levels up to 7.5% above your pre-pandemic baseline. I'm not sure how you're going to do 7.5% of a person. If you only had one person in a department, you're not going to get 7.5% of a person, but you are allowed to increase your staffing above the baseline, and you're going to have to watch that metric and how you go over. You can maintain compensation levels to prevent layoffs, meaning you're allowed to use some money to help prevent furloughing employees. You can fund workers who are furloughed. You can provide worker retention incentives. They don't call them bonuses, they call them incentives. So it's a little bit different. And you can actually provide and cover the administrative expenses for administering this program and others that respond to the pandemic, and to address administrative needs that were exacerbated or caused by the pandemic. Meaning, if you're finance directors on this call, and a lot of you are spending a lot of time on this, and so some of your time actually could be chargeable to this funding because you are spending this as much time as you are on it. It would allow you to hire temporary help, potentially, to help you get through this process as well. That's another option that would be available to you there, another example. One more big area within the guidance on the public health and economic impacts is Treasury has allowed for the investment of some capital projects. They are looking at focusing on things that benefit the area as a whole, and they're saying that you can subject to the same reasonable proportional standard as other uses. Meaning you can't just go out here and pick a project and make it. You've got to show why it's giving you good ways to address your pandemic impact. Recipients other than tribal governments have to provide a written justification for capital expenditures over $1 million. And if you have a project over $10 million, you're going to have to submit that written justification to Treasury with your project and expenditure reporting. Treasury does specifically state that they will not give pre-approvals based on those submissions, but they want to see those submissions. There are some things that are generally presumed eligible, things such as testing labs and equipment, emergency operations centers and equipment, affordable housing, childcare facilities for disproportionately impacted communities, things such as school and primary healthcare clinics are also allowed. Projects that will be generally presumed ineligible would be any type of new correctional facility, new congregate facilities, convention centers, stadiums, or other large capital projects that would be considered for general economic development or aid to impacted industries. You're going to have a specific focus. You can't just say, okay, we're going to build this big, great big new arena to use for the next 50 years, and it's going to be part of our funding. They're not going to go for that. But other capital projects would be available. I didn't even list all of the projects generally presumed eligible. There's a lot more within the guidance. I just gave a few examples. All right, this one I know is one that has gotten a lot of discussion. I've actually talked to some of you about this. And so I think this is an area that's still kind of very, very up in the air and people are struggling to understand it. But it's premium pay for essential workers. Essential workers can be paid above and beyond the normal wages per the guidance. They are allowed, you can be public sector or a third party role, meaning that you can actually allow premium pay for businesses in your community if they are in an essential worker role. Roles such as healthcare, emergency response, social services, family or child care, dental care, transportation and warehousing, pharmacy, maintenance, sanitation, grocery stores, and restaurants are all part of that list Treasury has provided. And there's some others in there as well. Essential work has to involve regular in-person interaction with patients, the public, or coworkers, or regular physical handling of items that were handled by or are going to be handled by patients, the public, or coworkers. Work performed remotely does not qualify at all. There is no part of remote work would qualify. Funds can be paid up to $13 per hour, but an employee cannot exceed $25,000 in the total. This next one's a little bit funnier. Pay must respond to worker needs. What does Treasury mean by that? Treasury is defining this as the eligible worker receiving premium pay is at or below 150% of their residing state or local average annual wage, whichever is higher on an annual basis. The worker should not be exempt from FLSA overtime provisions. If the worker fails to meet either of these requirements, you are going to have to submit written justification to Treasury detailing how the premium pay is response to the worker's needs and how that worker is performing essential services. Treasury is really looking at focusing this on those lower wage workers for whom telework has probably never been an option during the pandemic, and for whom the risk was truly greater. They're not looking to reward every single person. They're looking for those who truly were, I think, out in the front lines in the thick of it, and that's why they've given that justification the way they did. It doesn't mean that as a locality, you might want to give, maybe you're going to give premium pay to some of your public safety workers, some of your EMTs. But maybe you want to give things to other people who don't really meet that qualification. Well, that's where you're going to have to look at what do you have available to you through revenue loss or other things to pay people, and not necessarily that you can give everyone premium pay. Not everyone's going to fit that definition. Water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. These projects can get very big very quickly, and I think Treasury sees all of them as very critical because they deemed water and sewer infrastructure as very critical to public health. A solid, reliable water and sewer system is crucial to people's well-being. That's what they've decided. Treasury has a broad range of allowable costs. The interim final rule focused solely on the Clean Water and Drinking Water Acts that have been around for quite a few years, and basically projects under either one of those acts are allowable under CSLFRF. Since that was issued, Treasury has come back up with the final rule, and they have said, yes, those projects are all still eligible. And in addition, we're going to allow lead remediation, stormwater infrastructure, residential wells, and certain things, and reservoir and rehabilitation. The lead remediation can be things such as testing for lead service line replacement, and it can include things such as faucets, fixtures, and even internal plumbing in places such as schools and child care facilities. Stormwater infrastructure, Treasury gave examples such as culvert replacements, culvert upgrades, replacements of storm sewers. Residential wells is exactly what it sounds, and then certain dam and reservoir rehab. There's some information within the guidance that kind of covers some of that a little bit better. If you're in a situation where you're dealing with dam and reservoir work, you really should look at the guidance before you go too far down a project path there. The other key big infrastructure that Treasury focused on was broadband. And broadband infrastructure is something that has gotten a lot of attention since the start of the pandemic because of remote work, virtual school, and the impact that it had on rural and lower income communities who did not have access to reliable service. Therefore, Treasury has said that broadband projects are something that they really see as key and crucial to the ongoing recovery and moving on from the pandemic. Focus should be on projects that will serve locations that don't have reliable access to a wireline service of at least 100/20. I'm gonna mess it up. Say it right in a minute. megabits per second, megabits per second. What that basically means is you have to be able to download 100 megabits per second and upload 20. I can't tell you the difference other than I do know from my little bit of research that at that speed, you can have more than one computer operated at the same time, and you can have a reliable video connection that would allow you to participate in things such as this webinar and virtual schooling through Google Meets or those kinds of things. That is why that speed was determined. You have a broad flexibility to define broadband need in your community, but they do want you to focus on those communities that are considered underserved. The only exception to that speed service would be if it's completely impracticable for some reason, such as a really remote area that's just not going to be able to attain that speed. And one other really key requirement that Treasury is focusing on is they want you to partner with a service provider who either participates in the FCC's Affordable Connectivity Program or provides access to something commensurate to that program to aid in helping lower income households connect to this reliable service. One thing that has gotten the attention is that there have been broadband projects in the past. Localities have done broadband projects, but the cost to connect your individual household has been cost prohibitive to some families. Treasury wants something that's in place to alleviate that problem as well. There's one other thing on here, and I didn't put it on my slide, but I should have, because it's just as important, is Treasury has also said these funds can be used for the modernization of cybersecurity. This could be for existing and new broadband infrastructure, regardless of the delivery speed standards, and they can include modernization of hardware or software. Treasury is acknowledging that cybersecurity is extremely important and that upgrading those things for your broadband projects is an allowable cost, even for prior projects that were completed pre-pandemic. All right, polling question number 2. Now that we've gone through all these different crazy things, we have another polling question about have you developed your spending plan for this funding yet?
Launching the poll now. And Susan, we did have a question come in, so once I share the results, I will read that off to you.
Okay, great.
Closing the poll. All right, our winner was yes at 42%. Super auditor here was 33% and no at 24%.
All right. That sounds about right for people that have thought to you.
And our question here is, do you have any recommendation on documentation we can provide to support the reasonable impact requirement compliance?
I think your goal is going to be to show either through, you've got different options. You've got economic reports for your area. You've got how many people are behind, do you have a sudden increase in delinquent tax payments? People who've not, always have paid, now your tax rolls are showing a lot more delinquencies. School systems can let you know, hey, these are the kids that are struggling. Social services can let you know how much your food stamps, your Medicaid, your TANF, all those different things have increased. Those are all options to you. You kind of know, you can have anecdotal documentation. I think your goal is going to be that it's reasonable, that it's solid, that you think you can get there. And Treasury does give some examples within their guidance as well. I did not put any of those in the slide, but Alexa can give me the name of who asked the question, and I can certainly have a dialogue back and forth and pull together some information. But I think your goal is to use the information that's available to you through different studies and through your own ability to pull information through different departments in the local government to get some information. And I think you can probably come up with your support pretty easily that way. Was that the only question, Alexa?
Yes, that's it for now.
All right, I'll keep going. As I mentioned, I wanted to do a couple of things and compare a couple of key things, differences between these two different programs we have dealt with in the last couple of years. As most of you know, CRF was passed really quickly at the start of the pandemic as an immediate response. Treasury came out, and initially you only had about 9 months to spend that money. They then came back and they passed a law. Congress passed a law 2 days before the funds were supposed to expire that you now had another year to use the funds. But it still maintained a fairly short period of performance for such a big program. But really, it was focused on immediate short-term response. The guidance was changed and expanded multiple times. It felt like we were getting different FAQs and guidelines fairly quickly. Create a lot of confusion. It created a lot of gray areas. But allowed for justifications at times that were okay, but maybe they were a little questionable, and they gave us auditors a little heartburn. And I remember telling people before, well, technically it's not disallowed, but, and that was kind of the guidance we operated under. It was very, very confusing and stressful for everyone. All localities were subrecipients of their states. The way the money came out, some states didn't even share money with their localities. So for a lot of, you were very fortunate if your state did share money with you. And most of your reporting was done to the state either quarterly or in some kind of limited capacity. On contrast, CSLFRF funds are a long-term recovery focus. You've got more funding available to you. The cost can be incurred through December 31, 2024. And I want to point out something very important. This cost can be incurred. You don't have to pay and cut every check by December 31, 2024, but you have to have the cost incurred. Treasury defines that in more detail. The long story short is, as long as you have all of the contract projects going and costs are incurred by December 31, 2024, they're saying those are allowable. I think they're acknowledging with big construction contracts, it's going to be a little bit harder, not necessarily to have everything paid by that cutoff date. These rules are much more detailed, much more focused. Treasury has put out a lot more guidance from the start for this program versus what we had for CRF. I think there's a little bit less room for interpretation. There's a little bit less gray area. You're kind of going to be bound to what these things say. The reporting is definitely going to be more structured. People are direct recipients of Treasury. Even the towns and cities that receive money from the state, those of you that have received your money through the state, you're going to be reporting to Treasury. You're not going to be reporting to the state. It's a different process and structure than what we had before with CRF. So it's going to flow and operate differently, and your focus is going to be different. One of the big things that has come up, I've gotten this question several times, and so I specifically wanted to talk about these things today is, well, if it was allowable under CRF, will it be allowable under this program? Treasury actually has an FAQ about that. So I snipped it out and put it in my slides today. And that basically says, generally funding use is eligible under CRF as a response to the direct public health impacts of the pandemic will continue to be allowable with the following exceptions. One, the standard for eligibility of public health and safety payrolls has been updated. And two, any expenses related to the issuance of tax anticipation notes are not eligible funding use this time. Treasury allowed that with CRF. No debt service is eligible under the CSLFRF. I will point out that even if costs are similar, with Treasury's reasonably proportional standard within this guidance, circumstances and situations could differ now that may impact whether or not something is really the best use and should be considered allowable as well. And I touched on this briefly, but public safety payroll. A lot of you took a lot of your CRF dollars and chucked it to public safety payroll because you could do that as a whole. They were substantially dedicated by administrative convenience, and it allowed you to free up other general fund dollars to do other things that you needed to do. With CSLFRF, that is not an option. Straight up, it's not an option. You can use funds for that payroll, but it can only be for the portion of time spent responding to COVID-19. And you have to document your consideration of why an individual or department or unit is primarily dedicated to the response for COVID-19. There is no wholesale administrative convenience, and there is no just, hey, this unit's presumptively dedicated. The only way you can presume an entire unit is if their whole department or unit is spending more than 51% of their time on the pandemic response. That's going to be a hard bar to cross, I think, as the pandemic has aged and people's lives have adjusted and we found ways to kind of carry on a little bit more normally within the pandemic. But you're going to have to be able to justify your payroll costs. You're going to have to be able to justify your rationale, and you're going to have to periodically revisit that rationale. That's in Treasury's guidance as well. You can't decide today on February 3rd this is my assessment, and carry that all the way through to December 31, 2024. That's not going to work either. You're going to have to periodically revisit that assessment. So make sure if you want to claim public safety or public health payroll that you really understand how they're dedicated to the pandemic response. A few other things to keep in mind and consider. And the first one I'll start off with would be the unallowable costs and limitations for the CSLFRF program. Treasury has left a lot of latitude in what you can use the funds for, but they have said straight up these things are not allowed at all, either through revenue loss or through straight up claiming the expense through the program. No deposits of the pension funds for lump payments, extraordinary contributions for the purpose of reducing an accrued unfunded liability. You can claim routine payroll contributions associated with the wages of an allowable employee, however. That's allowable. It's just the above and beyond, the special contributions are not. Any debt service payments are not allowable. Treasury's stance is that funds are to be aimed at recovery, and debt service is funding past projects and not the future. The replenishment of rainy day funds or reserve replenishments are not allowable. You're not allowed to boost your reserves. You can't just throw it all in reserves and save it for another day. No satisfaction of any settlements or judgments can be paid with this funding. And last couple of things are getting key here lately with some things going on within Virginia in particular. You cannot use funds in a manner that will undermine CDC guidance recommendations with respect to COVID-19 mitigation practices. And funds can also not be used in a manner that violates Treasury's conflict of interest requirements or other applicable laws. Uniform guidance standards apply to this program throughout. Treasury's made that clear, and conflict of interest is one area where it is very important that you do not have any type of conflict with who you award funds to, contractors you use, or those kinds of things. That's going to get you in trouble with Treasury. Using these funds for matching. There's a couple of different things in the guidance. Any CSLFRF funding that you claim through revenue loss can be used as a non-federal cost share matching requirement. So if you've got an 80-20 federal grant and it's 80% federal and 20% local match, and you've got $5 million available to you through revenue loss, you can use some of that $5 million for your 20% match. However, you cannot use funds that are not claimed through revenue loss for that purpose, outside of two very specific exceptions that are defined in the guidance. There is a specific allowability written into the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act for using these funds for local match type purposes, and also for certain broadband deployment projects. And that's defined better in the guidance. I did not go in and try to pick apart the broadband deployment project. If you are working through a broadband project, that is something that you need to look at though, however. Also, these funds cannot be used for state Medicaid or CHIP programs for matching purposes, even if funds are available for revenue loss. That doesn't impact a lot of you on this call, but there are a few that might impact. I will say that those matching requirements are pretty well set in stone. Treasury has come out and said this is the only way you can use these funds. Procurement. We all like procurement. Okay, no, we don't. Never mind. No, we don't. But anyway, procurement, you're going to have to follow. Treasury has made it clear in all of their guidance, final rule, overview documents, webinars, etc., that all program funds must follow the procurement requirements in the uniform guidance. All goods and services will have to be procured in accordance with the requirements. And I will point out and keep in mind that the uniform guidance procurement requirements covers micro purchases and small purchases. So these are smaller purchases. And so this is not just a large project issue. This is not just a construction project issue. You have to follow uniform guidance for all of your procurements. You also need to pay very special attention to the fact that the uniform guidance has very specific requirements when it comes to emergency and sole source procurement. And for those of you that are used to Virginia Public Procurement Act requirements, in particular, there are some differences there. So please check the procurement guidance and the uniform guidance when you're doing these things. Another area that's gotten a lot of attention lately and seems to be gaining a lot of acceptability and traction is cooperative procurement. Those of you who work with transit have probably seen these for a long time. Small transit entities have long cooperatively procured their buses off of bigger transit systems for better rates. This has now started getting a lot more traction in other areas, and these are not prohibited by Treasury. The key will be the cooperative procurement you want to use must have been procured in accordance with requirements with the uniform guidance. You need to know that federal procurement standards were met when the original entity did their procurement, so your cooperative procurement will be allowable. That would be the key there. If you don't know that for sure, you want them to provide you proof, or you might want to just avoid using that one altogether. One other good thing to point out is Davis-Bacon wage rate requirements do not apply to this funding, with one exception. That one exception would be if you use these funds in conjunction with other federal funds for a project that does require Davis-Bacon to be followed, you will have to follow Davis-Bacon for these funds as well. That would be, for example, you're not using the funds for local match, but we're going to fund this big project, and it's going to be part clean water and part these dollars because we want to do the whole project. We don't have enough of either pot of money. We're going to use, and we've gotten permission to use both pots for this project. If you got to follow Davis-Bacon for one, you got to follow Davis-Bacon for all. That's just how that's going to work. That's the key takeaway from that. And my last polling question, I'll allow Alex to throw up real quick, is how comfortable are you with the procurement requirements contained in the uniform guidance? And auditors, I didn't give you a super auditor option. I want you guys to give a real honest answer to this one too.
The poll is up.
And while you're answering the poll, I'll just throw out a real important piece of information. I'm going to plug GFOA just slightly here. They have indicated that they're going to do a webinar on federal procurement. I don't know the date yet, but that date should get posted on GFOA's website and be in any GFOA emails you receive if you receive those. And if you're uncomfortable with procurement, I think that would be a really good place to get some information and get an overview. The GFOA's Federal Liaison Center is really knowledgeable, and I think they will provide a really good option there for learning more about procurement if you need to know.
Okay, closing the poll. 56% responded, I know just enough to be dangerous.
Yeah, that's what I expected was going to happen.
And we had one question come in, Susan, too.
All right, what's that question?
Can you discuss the CSLFRF terminology for subrecipient and subaward as it is required for reporting through the Treasury portal in comparison to how these are used for other federal grants?
Okay, yeah, let me see. I'm going to talk a little bit about subrecipients in a minute, but so there is a little bit of difference in that Treasury is going to want you to report all of your contracts, all of them, not just subrecipients, but all of your contracts over $50,000. Your subawards over $50,000 are going to be reported as well. That is a little different in that other grants may want you to report all of your contracts or subawards, and to the federal agency. Treasury is interested only in the ones that are $50,000. So if you do a subaward of $10,000 to somebody, you're not going to report that in the portal. You need to keep your documentation. You're still required and bound to monitor that subrecipient and provide them the same information you would a bigger sub, but you're not going to report that level of detail in the portal. Treasury, the actual guidance out there in terms of doing the federal transparency reporting for prime recipients is what Treasury is modeling this off at, but that is actually a $30,000 limit, and Treasury has gotten permission or been told they can up it to $50,000 for their purposes for this funding, probably because there's a large part of funding. The compliance and reporting documentation and the project and expenditure reporting documentation that Treasury has available on their website actually talks about this a little bit as well, in terms of how you're going to report it and what you're going to do. And because I don't get to go in and play with that portal the same way you guys do, because I don't have a portal login since I'm not a locality. And I really would encourage you to go walk through those steps that Treasury has in their reporting guidance. But I would be glad to talk to anybody about any questions they have about whether something should be reported or not from a conceptual standpoint individually. That would not be a problem. You can reach out to me. And look, reporting is the next thing coming up, so it kind of tied in really well. That whole question kind of shows that this reporting requirement for this funding is going to definitely be more expensive than what you had for CRF. Treasury's reporting requirement, and I know this graph is kind of small, but it seemed to be a better way to summarize it than any other way I could come up with. It's very, and it differs from by type of locality. Those of you, except for the very smallest, who did not, any use or Treasury calls you non-entitlement units because they did not allocate you funds directly originally, had to do an interim report as of August 31, 2021. And that was a one-time deal, a one-time interim report. A lot of you didn't have a whole lot to report at that point, but it was out there. Starting with January 31, 2022, for anybody receiving over 10 million in funds, or a population of more than 250,000, or a tribal government with more than 30 million in funds, you had to start doing quarterly project reports and expenditure reports. These smaller localities, those of you that were under 10 million in funds and under 250,000 in population, and all of you smaller towns and cities that were non-entitlement units, your first one of these is due April 30, 2022. The key for the smaller ones are you file these things annually. Everybody else does them quarterly. So if you're a small locality, at least you're not filing these things as often. I think Treasury recognizes that it's an administrative burden. But you will be filing these things quarterly. Those quarterly reports are where you're going to report your $50,000 or larger sub-awards. You're going to report your revenue loss calculations, and you're going to report your expenditures. And those of you who had to file one for the first time, you filed them on Monday. I haven't talked to anybody a whole lot yet about their experience. I do know there were some quirks and some issues, and Treasury was issuing out some alerts pretty quickly and rapidly there for a few days to try to help people get through the process. I will note that while Treasury has said you cannot go back and edit reporting based on what they have put out, you will be able to make changes in future reports to correct any issues that come out of the very first reporting cycle. So if there's issues in your reporting or you don't have all your facts quite right, you've got the option to fix it for your next quarterly report. Just bear with the process and breathe deep, and it'll get better. I will stress that, make sure you're doing all your reporting timely, and make sure there's controls in place to make sure reporting happens timely and completely, since everything is submitted electronically. But this whole reporting process, we're still learning it. I haven't gotten to look at completed reporting yet. That is something that I want to do so that I feel more comfortable talking to people about it. But I think it's the process that's going to keep learning and growing. And only the biggest entities had to file what Treasury calls a recovery plan performance report. The states, all the states had to file it, and any cities or counties with a population of more than 250,000. I will point out, and I have it later on in another slide as well, I think it's my next slide, that you can actually go online, the link on that slide, and see the interim report and the recovery plan performance reports that were filed by August 31, 2021 for your locality if you filed them, and for any other locality. Treasury is publishing these things online, so you can actually go see what others are doing if you want. You can go see how you compare to others of similar size. But the information is out there, as I already talked about. The contracts and subawards thing, I think a lot of us are used to the whole subaward concept from the FFATA reporting, the Federal Transparency Act reporting, but this contract concept is slightly different. But again, it's going to be your big contracts, and you're going to need to keep all of that information so you can compile those things. If you have different departments within your locality doing different pieces, you're going to have to make sure you or whoever is responsible for the reporting is getting all this information from all of these key places to get this reporting complete and accurate from the start. That would be the key there to keep in mind. And you're going to do these quarterly reports or annual reports, depending on your size, throughout the duration of the project and for a time period after. Treasury is actually, and I think it's on my previous slide, not this one, Treasury has actually said that based on the period performance, reporting will be collected through April 30, 2027 in certain cases. So this doesn't go away when the funding ends. They're going to keep getting reports to make sure things are wrapped up the way they're supposed to be. Now, obviously that ties into the single audit. What are the auditors going to do? Well, we're bound by what the compliance supplement tells us. So based on what we know right now, here's what we know. Here's what we have. This is going to be a major program for pretty much everybody. the funding involved, the amount of funds you're going to use, it's going to be a major program. For most of you, it's going to be a major program for multiple years. Treasury and OMB have designated this to be a program of higher risk. What does that mean? That means that we have to consider this program to be riskier than the average typical program when we make our risk assessments and determine what we're going to test every year. So if I need to test X percentage of your, whether you're low risk or high risk oddity, X percentage of your federal programs, one of the key considerations I have to look at is what is Treasury designated as a higher risk program? And that's going to help drive my risk assessment process into what I test. Those of you from smaller towns who have not had single audits in the past, or maybe haven't had them in quite some time, this will be a very, very new process for you. I will encourage you to reach out to your auditor and talk through what's going to happen and what that's going to mean for you as you go along if you've not had audits in the past with single audits. In a lot of cases, this is going to add to your number of programs that we test, not reduce. The reason being is that we have to test your federal dollars on a rotating basis for all of your bigger programs. So just because ARPA is this big, huge pot of money doesn't mean some of the other programs won't be tested as well. This won't be the only program we're testing for many of you. Treasury and OMB released a compliance supplement addendum in December that gave us a good indication of what we'll be testing going forward. I will say that for the FY22 audits, we will need the 2022 compliance supplement to be able to say for sure, but based on an addendum, the things that we're going to be looking at testing will be your activities allowed or unallowed. So testing a sample of disbursement. We're going to look at not only direct expenditures of the funds, but anything you have paid through revenue loss as well. Treasury's guidance and OMB's guidance says that revenue loss in and of itself is not an allowable use, and our testing will need to focus on what you've paid with those dollars. So that will be, you'll be bound to help us figure out what have you paid, not only straight from the program funds, but what have you paid with revenue loss dollars. We're going to need both populations for our testing. As a heads up, keep that in mind. We're going to make sure it was paid during the period of performance. In these early rounds, our focus will be, did you try to claim costs prior to March 3, 2021? As the end date is still over 2 years away, so we're not worried about you hitting the end date at this point. We'll be testing procurement, like I already mentioned. We'll test your reporting. Did you file it timely? Was it accurate? Was it complete? And we'll be testing your subrecipient monitoring process. And that's something I'll talk about on another slide, but how you monitor and communicate with your subrecipients. We're going to have to test that process as well based on what Treasury's put out so far. Some of these things will relate very similar to some of the things we had test for CRF. So I thought I would take some of the findings we had from CRF and turn them into lessons to take from our CRF single audit this past year. And there were a couple of very key areas that kept coming up, so I list them all out here. When using the portal reporting like we have had with CRF, even with some of the ESSER funds for some of the education grants, and the portal for the CSLFRF process, we need to make sure that controls over reporting are still in place. This has been a very challenging area for many of you. Reports being submitted electronically, maybe reviews aren't happening as clearly or as well. We need to make sure these are still happening. Make sure you can show what was submitted, that it was reviewed, that it was submitted timely. If Treasury keeps posting reports online, that will help us in getting reports after the fact, but you're still going to have to be able to show us you submitted it timely. Retain copies of anything you can, what you're filing and using to support these reports. Make sure you have them. Otherwise, we have a hard time auditing that. We don't know what you did. All of your subrecipients, whether you give them $5,000 or $50,000 or more, all subrecipients should have written agreements that discuss the use of the funds, the assistance listed number of the funds, what they're bound to follow, the rules of the program. You need to have a periodic monitoring process in place. How are you monitoring that the sub is using those funds appropriately? How are you monitoring that the sub knows what they're doing with this process? Verbal communications, informal emails, all of those different things are not going to meet the requirements of having a written agreement. The written agreement is a requirement of the uniform guidance. Make sure you have those. And for all of your expenses, whether it is public safety payroll, whether it is assistance to households, make sure you have documentation that supports your rationale in writing. Don't come back and do something in, say, September that we're going to audit next May, you know, and hope you can remember what was done and why. Don't rely on your memory or on others to retain information. Make sure you have all the documentation available and you know where it is and how to get to it. You want to be able to support it, not just to your external auditors, but to Treasury. Treasury may come out and audit people. They have not indicated how they're going to do their own review process, but Treasury is going to look at different things as they go along. They indicated they will do something. What that is, I don't know yet. One other thing I'll talk about, and because Treasury talks about this as well, in their reporting and compliance guidance document they issued a few months ago, Treasury brought up internal controls. You know, and in our audits, single audits, we have to test internal controls. And large dollars like these often get people brought in from various departments who don't always typically work with federal dollars. So I think it's very important you make sure your controls are in place and that people are aware of what they are. Treasury has put out some examples of some best practices in their compliance and reporting document. I snipped them here because I thought they were really good. And they're a great starting point. But I will stress that throughout the uniform guidance and throughout Treasury's communications, they are stressing written policies and procedures. It is very important that your written policies and procedures are current and complete. That is definitely a starting point for everybody if you do not have them. The other thing that you need to make sure is that your written standards of conduct, conflict of interest policies are also current and complete. Treasury would look at those things if they did come in and audit you. Those are things they are going to want to see. Those of you who have dealt with any federal auditors from other agencies lately, such as Department of Justice, Department of Ed, or Transit, know that they are looking at your written policies and procedures off the bat when they come in and start doing their own reviews. Other things, make sure you have written records of different things. You want to have all of your information together and have it in proof. They're not going to take verbal as an option only. And as auditors, we don't really take verbal only either. My last couple of slides are just resources. I gave you links to Treasury's website. On this website, Treasury has a final rule document. They have an overview document. They have indicated they plan on publishing a frequently asked questions document on the final rule at some point in the future. They have reporting guidance and guides, and you can even sign up for updates right over here on the right-hand side. You can sign up for updates from Treasury about what they are updating and how often. I get those updates are actually kind of useful. It lets me know when stuff gets posted without me having to check their website like an obsessed person about information when I'm looking for something. I would encourage everyone on this webinar to read Treasury's overview document and final rule. It's 44 pages. Is it the most exciting reading? No, but it does give you a good understanding of what's going on. Some other key places you can go get good information, I mentioned them already once, is GFOA, the National Association of Counties, and the National League of Cities are all publishing a lot of information. They're all doing webinars. They're all getting a lot of guidance out there, discussion groups, they're doing advocacy for you at the federal level. These are places that you can go get other information as well. And of course, you can also talk to your friendly auditors or your friendly neighborhood auditor, as Matt called us earlier, and I will gladly take questions from people. I answer them as quick as I can. Occasionally they're a little swamped, but if you have questions, you can always feel free to reach out to me directly as well.